Module 2, Lesson 1, Introduction to Depop. In this lesson, I would like to give you an overall view of the depopulation program in its modern form. Since the end of the Second World War and with the formation of the United Nations in 1945, international peace and stability have been maintained by controlling population growth. Unbeknown to the masses, governments have used covert methods to limit births in developed and underdeveloped countries alike, and to accelerate deaths in Africa and a few critically poor and overpopulated areas elsewhere. Births have been prevented by interfering with the reproductive system so as to lower human fertility, while deaths have been promoted by weakening the immune system so as to increase morbidity and mortality. The methods used by every country to control population growth have been dictated by the level of development and the existing infrastructure, as much as by political will or the lack thereof, and have been either imposed by force and deception from the outside or adopted willingly by the governing military and scientific elites of nation-states that have relied on the moral, technical, and monetary assistance of the United Nations, its agencies, and the greater international community. Regardless of the methods used to control population and whether they are imposed or self-imposed, strict secrecy and deception have been necessary to prevent the masses from discovering the bitter truth that for the past 70 years they have been the object of a silent and global offensive, a campaign of attrition that has turned the basic elements of life into weapons of mass sterility and selective death. Without our knowledge or consent, governments the world over have subverted our reproductive freedom and ability to procreate to achieve ambitious and necessary demographic objectives, and in the process have committed the most odious and wide-sweeping crimes in human history to save mankind from even greater evils: nuclear annihilation, mass starvation, and environmental devastation. The birth of nearly 2 billion people has been prevented and the death of 500 million hurried. While these goals have been intentional, the architects of the global depopulation policy have unintentionally undermined the genetic and intellectual endowment of the human species and have set back eons of natural selection. Their intentions have never been malevolent, but the unintended results of their actions are frightening. What is the genesis of this benevolent evil? We started to become victims of our own success when science and technology gradually enabled us to survive the natural scourges that have kept us in check throughout history: disease, war, famine, and death. These four horsemen of the apocalypse have been the natural enemies of our species, and we have been waging war on them since times immemorial. And as we have largely vanquished them, we found ourselves unchallenged on Earth. We have become an unstoppable force, absorbing Earth's space and productive capacity and displacing all other species to make room for our ever-growing needs and numbers. We now confront a set of physical realities that are unprecedented: overpopulation, overconsumption, and long lifespans. For the first 250 million years of our existence, we have struggled to survive and remained few in numbers, reaching 500 million by the late Middle Ages. In the succeeding 300 years, from circa 1500 AD to 1800 AD, we doubled our numbers, thanks to improvements in agriculture, transportation, and distribution. Population pressures during these 3 centuries were relieved by emigration to the New World. The next doubling, from 1 to 2 billion, took only 1 century and occurred with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, when Europe's population began to grow at an unprecedented pace. Medical advances allowed most children to survive childhood, while better nutrition and sanitation extended the lifespan. Population pressures during this time were relieved by European conquest and the exploitation of colonies in Africa and Asia. As the benefits of science and technology became global, the surge in population became global too, and 1 billion people were added in only 50 years, bringing the total to 3 billion by 1950. Population pressures in this half-century could no longer be absorbed by either migration or the exploitation of colonies, and this led to a bitter struggle for resources during the two world wars. A struggle that has ravaged entire nations and killed more than 80 million people, more casualties than all other conflicts in history combined. Since 1950, we have added 1 billion people every 10 to 15 years, bringing the total population to 4 billion by 1970, to 5 billion by 1987, to 6 billion by 1990, and to 7 billion by 2011. The population is expected to peak at 9 billion by 2050 and then start to decline. The reason the population is expected to peak by 2050 is not because of prosperity and education, as we are led to believe, but because the global elites that make up the international community and control the United Nations have taken proactive measures since 1945 to ensure that resource scarcity and national greed do not cause World War III. For better or worse, we owe them 7 decades of relative peace and stability, which is an extraordinary achievement when one considers that this was accomplished while the population has grown at the fastest pace in history. If our leaders had taken no proactive measures to curb population growth, we would now face a global population of 9 billion instead of 7. And our numbers would continue to double every 20 to 30 years and reach 14 billion by 2050, 28 billion by 2080, and 56 billion by the end of this century. Judging by the dismal state of half of the world's peoples and by the alarming pace of environmental degradation, even the current population is unsustainable. We must not forget that even at 7 billion, half of us live in poverty or abject poverty, despite the tremendous scientific and technical advances of the past half-century, and that in many places on Earth, conditions are so volatile and desperate that societies are on the brink of collapse. The population explosion clearly bodes global catastrophe. Not only has the global population grown at the fastest pace in human history during the past 6 decades, but its needs per capita have also grown at the fastest pace in human history, and in fact at a much faster pace than the exponential population growth we have experienced. The average modern human being consumes 100 times more resources than our forefathers a couple of centuries ago did, and at least 5 times more resources than our grandparents did in 1950. This means that for all intents and purposes, the 7 billion people who are alive today have a much greater impact on the planet's ecosystems than an equivalent number of our forebears in the distant or immediate past. Consequently, the planet is straining under our load. Soil erosion, carbon dioxide accumulation, rapid deforestation, perhaps even global warming, and certainly the melting of the polar caps and glaciers are but some of the consequences of the environmental burden we have become as a species. Given the impact we have on the planet at 7 billion strong, it takes no scientist to foresee that the planet cannot possibly sustain 14 billion of us, let alone 28 billion. which is where we would be heading in less than a century, had there been no proactive intervention and aggressive interference with our ability to have children. As our needs and numbers increase, we are placing unsustainable demands on critical resources like water and fossil fuels, which are vital to our survival and define our standard of living. Water shortages are already an impediment to development and even a threat to bare survival, causing conflict within and between nations. Both our freshwater supplies and our fossil fuel reserves are in crisis. 1.1 billion people live without clean drinking water and 2.6 billion lack adequate sanitation. And these combined problems kill nearly 4,000 children every day from waterborne diseases. For some nations, water shortages are critical and growing worse from year to year because dwindling reserves need to be shared by an increasing number of people. Daily per capita use of water in residential areas varies accordingly. While North America and Japan have 350 liters at their disposal for every person, Europe has only 200 liters and Sub-Saharan Africa has a paltry 10 to 20 liters. Water consumption in the 20th century has increased sixfold and at twice the rate of population growth. Americans, for instance, used 7 gallons of water per day a century ago and 145 gallons today. Since development has occurred earlier and faster in some countries than in others, and the politics of conquest and exploitation have prevented equitable distribution, per capita consumption differs greatly around the globe in more than just water and oil. North Americans on average consume 3 times more resources than Europeans, 5 times more than the Japanese, 20 times more than Asians, and 40 times more than Africans. If everyone on Earth were to have America's standard of living, then the existing global resources could sustain only 1.2 billion people. If we would be content with Europe's standard of living, then our resources would sustain 3.6 billion. And if we were to universally adopt the Japanese standard of living, then our global resources could theoretically accommodate 6 billion. The problem is that the demands we make on the environment are already much greater than the Earth's capacity to regenerate, which is why the environment is collapsing and we're running out of vital resources. This means that our planet could not sustain 1.2 billion Americans in perpetuity, any more than it could sustain 3.6 billion Europeans or 6 billion Japanese. However you slice it and dice it, we can only come to one conclusion, namely that there are far too many of us, and if we are to continue to consume resources as voraciously as we have become accustomed to, and that all others on Earth are aspiring for, and that our level of civilization demands, we have no choice but to drastically reduce our numbers to a level that is within the Earth's ability to regenerate. After all, we cannot reverse our standard of living and work towards making our lives harder. It is not in our nature to curb our aspirations, but it is within our means to curb our population. Not only is it not within our nature to curb our aspirations, it is also not possible to consume fewer resources per capita in our technologically advanced age. The more advanced our technology becomes, the more resources we consume per capita. The technology of the past was rudimentary and required few resources. Take, for instance, this wool spinner here on my left. It is made of a few sticks of wood and requires only human energy to work. Compare this with the smartphones that we use today, which require nearly 13 tons of water to be manufactured and include aluminum alloys for the body, lithium, cobalt, and carbon graphite for the batteries, gold, copper, and silver for the wiring, platinum and tungsten for the circuitry, and an array of rare metals such as neodymium, iron boron, dysprosium, and praseodymium to make the magnets, speakers, and motors found in our phones. And that is only what is needed to manufacture these phones. To support the system of satellites orbiting in space and the computer servers and antennas over the entire surface of Earth, the material and energy requirements that make the functioning of our smartphones possible are just enormous. So merely halting the global population at 7 billion is not a solution. How well we want to live will determine how many of us the Earth can accommodate. And since human nature demands constant improvement in our way of life, we can only fulfill our personal and civilizational needs by further reducing our numbers. Not only is the Earth overpopulated and straining under our ever-growing demand for resources, we now also live longer than ever before. Life expectancy has risen dramatically over the course of the past 100 years. While at the beginning of the 20th century one could expect to live about 35 years, at the beginning of the 21st century one can expect to live nearly 70 years. This doubling of our lifespan means that modern human beings not only consume substantially more resources than people in the past, but that they also consume them for twice as long as our forefathers. Overpopulation, overconsumption, and long lifespans are polar opposites of the conditions under which man lived in the distant past, when he was at the mercy of nature, was scarce in numbers, lived from hand to mouth, and died young. We have overturned the natural equilibrium that keeps species in symbiotic relationships, and in so doing we have become a threat to the natural environment that sustains all life on Earth, including our own. If we have learned anything, is that progress comes at the cost of nature, but can only occur in a healthy natural environment. The competing demands of progress and nature can only be reconciled if progress occurs within nature's finite limits. And for that to occur, there must be fewer of us. Few enough, in fact, for nature to absorb and repair our impact. The cost of progress has taught us three important lessons. 1. Given human nature, consumption per capita will only increase from one generation to the next. 2. The greater the ecological footprint per capita, the fewer people can be accommodated by Earth's finite resources. And 3. Human civilization cannot survive into the future unless it learns to live within the regenerative capacity of Mother Earth, thus within the limits of the natural environment and its finite resources. What we are about to learn is that having won the uphill battle, we must now win the downhill battle. Now, let me explain. To increase in numbers, our civilization has had to overcome natural obstacles set to preserve the balance within ecosystems. A hard-won equilibrium from millennia of evolution that once disrupted has caused nature great harm. If we are to restore the natural balance that sustains all life on Earth, we must now decrease our population or else perish. But to decrease the population, our civilization must overcome man-made obstacles set to preserve the socio-economic balance within societies. A hard-won equilibrium from centuries of give and take, trial and error, conflict and cooperation, therefore damaging the fabric of society. The upward and the downward battles are equally hard and disruptive, the former on nature and the latter on society. Only a stable population living within nature constraints can survive in perpetuity and continue to evolve. If we fail to achieve such a state of equilibrium between man and nature, we will find ourselves living on a planet denuded of all animal and plant life, and we will die along with it. Only man can stop man. This was realized by those with foresight who quietly began to take proactive measures, unhindered by the indifference or ignorance of the vast majority, who was unable to foresee and remains unwilling to accept the impact we have as a species that has risen above the natural element and has succeeded in harnessing nature solely to its own advantage, and who as a result now lives in a parasitical and therefore unsustainable relationship with nature. Once these enlightened minds realized that the global population must be stabilized, they had to find a way to stabilize it. The decision and the political will to tackle population control came about at the League of Nations, which existed from 1920 to 1945, but failed. It succeeded, however, at the United Nations, which was set up immediately after World War II to maintain peace between nations, thus to avoid war at all costs. But war was the last remaining natural enemy to unrestrained population growth, since famine and pestilence have been largely eliminated in the first half of the 20th century. The United Nations, therefore, was faced with the unenviable task of having to find a substitute to war as a means to stop the population explosion. And not only had humanity lost the taste for war after 2 world wars that occurred in a single generation, but the development of nuclear weapons make the idea of war inconceivable, as it would mean assured mutual annihilation. What is the point of waging war if no one can win it? As there would be nothing left at the end of a nuclear war. If the carnage of war, the last remaining scourge of humanity, could no longer be relied upon to reduce our numbers, so that nations could live within their means, then a way had to be found to prevent the birth of new people. And that is how the raison d'etre of the United Nations and the primary premise for the existence of an international community came to be population control. Once the decision was made to pursue international peace and cooperation to avoid war, the realization that the only way to preserve peace is by ensuring that nations live within their means was inevitable, as was the realization that to live within the available means, every country had to limit the growth of its population. The community of nations, under the auspices of the United Nations, had only to find and agree upon acceptable ways to prevent a new life, which proved to be easier said than done. Tremendous obstacles stood in the way.